Thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Tell us a little bit about NIIT's purpose and mission.
So we formed the company in 1981, that's 33 years ago, with a very simple mission, which was to bring people and computers together successfully. And that mission created two set of activities. One was training people about IT, so people and computers, meaning young people who want to learn about IT. The other was corporations, government departments trying to use IT in their day-to-day life. So there the link of the people and computers was much more about what to do with IT, whereas the first one was how to teach people. So these two divisions eventually became the learning business, which is NIIT Limited, as we call it, listed company. And 2004, we demerged the software business and created a second listed company, which we called NIIT Technologies. So there are two companies, they carry the same NIIT portion, but NIIT Limited is all about learning and technology in learning, and NIIT Technology is about software.
Mm-hmm. And how many students are in the class in any given period?
Well, we did do a count because some of our programs are very short and some go to 4 years. So if you just had to do the number of names, if we had to list, we counted 2 years ago that 35 million people have been through our system in this time. But at any one time today, there would be about 500,000 people somewhere in the world who are doing something on NIIT programs. And that's in the learning business, of course.
Tell us why you decided to start an IT training and education company.
Well, in 1981, prior to that, I used to work for India's leading computer company. And I was involved in planning, corporate planning, and thinking about the future of the company as one of the members of the leadership team. And so we had started making computers in India, and we were getting a good demand coming from the end user community. But we always found that our customers were struggling with two very big issues. One was about building a good plan on how to embrace technology in the organization, what to do with IT. And the second question they had was they were not getting enough talent to help them run their computers. So this used to be a perpetual thing which would come up in all our planning exercises as a constraint to growth. And so the idea of NIIT was born out of that constraint, should we say.
Okay. Which countries are you present in?
Well, in many countries in Asia. We're there in China, we've been in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, that whole belt, the ASEAN region. We've been in South Asia in many countries, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, that region. And then we were active in the Middle East, it's less now. And then, of course, in 7 countries in Africa as well. So our learning center model has been typically a developing country model. But in the developed countries, we figured that the learning center phenomena by the time we were building our business was already rather slow. And building a brand in a developed economy was a very expensive proposition. So we started doing projects for companies for the in-house learning requirements. Because we had built a lot of tools. We had built virtual classrooms, we have built learning management systems. We have one of the largest content development facilities in the world for learning content, even today. So we use those capability to serve in a business-to-business model. So in US and Europe, that's the model of learning that we do.
Tell us about some of the group's major accomplishments.
Well, the learning business, when we started it in 81, it took off extremely well. There was a very big demand. So our first challenge was how to grow it rapidly without letting the standards fall. Because in the service industry, like a restaurant, for example, if you have a very successful first place, it doesn't mean that you can make 20 more by just hiring managers and asking them to use the same recipe. So in the services sector, the entrepreneur has to stay very close to the customer, the consumer, so that you can get the feedback and then make corrections and be relevant and appropriate. So the big challenge we had, the first big challenge we had was how to grow rapidly without dropping our standards. And therefore, two set of things. So there's a whole lot of innovations around process capability, consistency, methodology, underlying technology. But we felt that that still wouldn't be enough. We didn't need layers of managers running these learning centers. So we created the concept of franchising in education. The first time I think it was done anywhere, 1984, 85, we started thinking of it. So, and ultimately in our period, we've created 2,000 entrepreneurs in 40 countries. And that has been, I think, one of the very big and interesting things we did, which helped us to scale, because each of our partners was an entrepreneur very close to his or her customers. So that helped us to maintain this whole idea of standards and quality while supporting them with methods and processes and so on. So that was one of the very big things, I would say. But then extensive use of technology in learning, in the management of learning. And so we've done a lot of innovation in use of technology in delivering learning and managing learning and being relevant with a very high standard to customers in all these 40 countries.
Mm-hmm. So the competition is intense and revenues have been under pressure. So how do you compete with other IT training companies?
So in the conventional competition, I think if I look at the developing country model of learning centers, our combination of very strong process capability and this business model of franchising, this has been a winning combination. And very few people could really rise up to the expectations. So in India, for example, we have the computer, there's an industry magazine called DataQuest, which has been running it for 21 years now. And in every category of the industry, the software industry, the hardware people, the telecom people, and the training, they have awards of who's the biggest and so on. And in every one of these years, we've been number one right through. So, of course, we've gone up and down with the way the whole world has gone with IT, .com and so on, so forth, a slow period. 2009 onwards, again a slow period. But we've remained on top, I think, in the learning business essentially because of this combination of very high standards because of processes and an entrepreneurial organization because our partners are all entrepreneurs. So I think these two would be, among there are many things, but perhaps the most important things for the learning business being a space where we've had a very good hold on the market.
Mm-hmm. How do you compete with other sites that offer courses online?
We started looking at the role of technology in learning right from the beginning. In fact, in India, we did the first conference called COMET 83, I remember, Computers in Education and Training, in 1983. And it's been a long time waiting, should we say, because we expected technology to play a much bigger role in learning. And it is only in the last few years that we are finally beginning to see that online learning is taking place, even though the internet has been around for a long time. And the reason for that is really that learning behaviors are shaped when we are in school. And if adults are coming to learn, by that time they've been through 12 or 13 or 14 years of education through a certain method, which is the classroom method. And for them to adapt to the new method is not easy. It's even more difficult for teachers who've been teaching in a certain fashion. So I think while the technology has been around, its adoption has been very slow. But now when we see that the young generation who's been very comfortable with computers for the last 10 years, when they're looking at online learning, they're actually taking to it far more easily. I would say that the teachers are still grappling with the problem. They think it's a loss of control. So we don't have the same tailwind behind the teachers. And there are only a few innovators, but a vast majority still are not very comfortable because the way they learned when they were in school was different. So we have to wait for some more time. But the good news is that learners are now becoming much more liberated. And so while as learning companies, we tried to blend the two things as a business model. We do that. We think that blended learning is the only way. You can't have a pure classroom. It's far too expensive and not very effective. And a pure online, which needs a very highly motivated learner. And most learners are kind of reasonably motivated and many are not very motivated. So for them, online learning just doesn't work. They're all used to someone sitting, either the mom or the dad or the teacher egging them on. But what's beginning to happen now is that the motivated learners are actually blending their learning by their choice. They'll go into a classroom and before or after that they'll do something online. So this is actually the new fuel. So in this world actually competition is suddenly got very fragmented. And anyone who puts up a good program is a competitor, much like in publishing, much like in news. So I think the clarity which we had till 5 or 7 years ago about who's the competition is beginning to dissolve. And so we have to be far more innovative, much faster on the toe, should we say, on the feet. But we also have realized that earlier learning used to be about giving content and making sure the person receives it. Now there's more content than the world needs, more or less. So learning now is actually much more about creating the whole experience of getting a learner to identify what they need to learn, and then to figure out how they'll build their plan, and then to evaluate and test. I would say it's very difficult today to take a big sheet of paper and see who your competition is. Very difficult.
There's also many sites that offer online courses for free. How do you
So that's
view
been
them?
there for a while. As you know, the whole MIT experience of open courseware has been there for a long time. But it's like saying that if you tell students and lock them in a room and say all the books of the world are here, will they study? And the answer is no. So content being free is helpful, but it's not enough. So, and even the experience that the online learning programs have is that many people start, but only a small single digit end up doing these courses. So therefore the intent of the providers is that anyone who comes online should learn and learn comprehensively. That objective is still not being met. So online learning as an important component of learning is there, but online learning as an end, I think, is still elusive and will be for some time.
Tell us about some global trends that you're seeing in the IT industry.
So I think the biggest buzz is obviously about online learning. That's the biggest buzz. Though if you were to do a calculation of how much percent is learnt in the class and how much is online, for most sections of society is still predominantly in the classroom. But the rate of change year after year in the last 3 or 4 years is beginning to go up. So that's the big change, that the young learners are beginning to take to online learning with much more fun and joy than they were even 5 years ago. That's the biggest shift at one level. The other shift in learning, and that is true, I would say, now in more and more countries in the world, is that the young people are not valuing degrees as much as they did in the past. So even otherwise, we do find that the employer world has been very critical of the higher education system, that you're not really producing the people we want. And now we have these bright, young, energetic people who are learning a lot on their own, and when they show up for employment, they do as well, if not better sometimes, than someone who's carrying a piece of paper. So this is the other shift. Now this is very slow, and perhaps it's much more in the metropolitan cities than in small towns and therefore in developing countries. But there is a very definite shift that employers are beginning to evaluate potential employees based on competencies they want to judge rather than what piece of paper they have. This is a big shift. It's a slow shift, and I think it's going to be very significant over the next 10 years. So, because today a lot of people go to that place just to get the certification. So, if employers find alternative methods or alternative signaling methods to figure out who has the competence for the job, because remember that even employers are now completely prepared for a workforce which doesn't want to live for a lifetime in the company. So it's a much more of a contractual short-term relationship, and therefore even employers in many companies, particularly small startups, look for what are your skills today, and I will measure them. I'm not going to leave it to someone else. So the intermediation which was happening through certificates, as it kind of dissolves, and as the potential company of the future, which is a small company which is kind of going in and out of things, they keep, so it will be a whole lot of small companies and individual floating in as free agents, evaluating their short-term needs. And I think there to say you're a PhD in something may not mean too much. That is a much longer shift, but a much more fundamental shift. We are beginning to see convergence, which we've read about for 2 decades now, that all devices start coming onto the same thing, which is the handset. So I think the big shift, if you have to look at the most significant shift, is there's a mobile device. I think it's going to be bigger than the conventional phone. It'll probably be smaller than the iPad. And so we'll find a range of sizes between these two, which people feel comfortable enough to manage most of their reading and writing on. So this is the most important change, because communication, work, everything will happen through the device, and therefore learning will happen through the device. So mobility of the device will really change where we study. Okay? The fact that content is online and digital will also change when we study. It will be asynchronous. If you're a great teacher and you are also on TV somewhere or on video somewhere, and if someone helps me to figure out that if I'm learning this stuff, then I could get you a 20-minute video here like we're doing here, and if I can configure it, then I can choose when I learn. So the mobility gets you where, this gives you when. And if we have good content management systems and good layers of like menu cards in a restaurant to configure what I want to learn, then even what I want to learn will become more flexible. So when you want to learn, where you want to learn, what you want to learn, all these are changing, and there are different technologies which are serving this. So for example, we have this whole field of analytics, which is managing tons of data. So if I want to configure something, I want to make some set of choices, then if there are powerful search engines and other tools behind my layers of menus which I get, who can search for me and put things together like Google does, and they do the search, but configurations can be done. So there'll be a whole lot of technologies which will help me configure that if I'm thinking about learning something, what are the choices, how do I put them together, many of those functionalities within many famous search facilities. So I think there'll be technologies to help deal with large data sets, and we use the word analytics to define that, or to deal with big data. That's one whole technology. We deal with stuff. And there's the whole thing about mobility, more and more easy to go to anywhere, wherever you want. And to me, the device is going to be perhaps the more important thing. So right now we do have to carry something. Can we roll it up, fold it, open it and see it? There'll be a lot of stuff happening, and then how to get power for that, how to power those devices. If you're using solar but there's a cloud, then what you do. So I think there'll be technologies around energy for the device and visibility of the device and its weight, and that will be one whole. So what's the device that I use for learning? And of course, telecom area is evolving rapidly, and we're getting higher and higher speeds. But we are getting higher and higher amount of data moving as well. So the telecom field, reading large tons of data, then presenting it. In each of these spaces, there's a lot of technologies that are coming to help us learn what we want, when we want, where we want.
Now, you've been in the industry for about 30 years. What are some of the most significant changes that you've seen in the technology space since you've been in it?
Perhaps the biggest breakthrough came with the internet, quite clearly. Going from the period when we had very primitive networks with limitations. So one of the most liberating forces was the internet. And because that really helped people to connect with people to connect with content, people to connect with. So internet has perhaps been the most defining of the technologies which has made a difference. In the field of learning, we've seen a lot of pedagogy, or the science of learning, being supported by technology. So for example, when we want to do assessment, assessment also needs very sophisticated models of evaluation. So I would call that science more than technology, but the ability to be able to do assessments whenever you want, on whatever subject you want. So a lot of software which constructs a valid question, for example, and then assesses the responses. So today we can only do multiple choice, but now we are beginning to get a method where you can answer in a paragraph, and there's software which can start deriving meaning from it. This is the big thing which will make a difference on how assessments are done, because today we just are limited to, checkbox kind of things. So this is an evolving field, and this is, I think, going to be important, because as a teacher, the most valuable thing you do is to give feedback to a student through a combination of factors, not just checkbox. So this part of giving good assessment and good feedback is another very promising technology. It's primitive, but that will make a big difference, and there's early work going on which is very promising, which I think all of us are waiting for.
How has NIIT had to adapt to the changing needs in technology, and what changes in leadership were necessary to stay relevant?
You have to wake up every morning and think of what's new. So that's a mentality more than anything else. And so that has to be in the culture. So building an organization which remains curious is perhaps the biggest challenge for any company that wants to last. So as I said, we've been number one all this period in our part of the world, simply by making sure that our people are looking around and are curious about what's happening. So I think building curiosity as a part of the organizational culture is key. So it also means that you have to keep refreshing your talent. But then you have to build organizational practices which encourage challenging what's existing. So there's a whole lot of practices we have and really have put into the company, where groups of people work on challenging existing norms and finding new ways. So that's an organizational culture issue. And so we have to perpetuate that culture. And that is not a difficult thing if you've been at it from day one. So whether it's the delivery model, it's the content, it's the business model, everything is up for grabs and for people to challenge and build anew. So to me, that perhaps is the most important thing, that if you can build a capacity in the people and the organization to keep looking for new things, a hunger for new things, then it perpetuates. And that's what we've tried to do in our whole corporate philosophy. So for example, we were the first one to write in 1986 when we wrote a vision document. We said one of the 10 statements was that we recognize the necessity of making mistakes when it contributes to innovation and learning. It's not just mistake for the sake of it, but the necessity of making mistakes as against we will tolerate mistakes or it's okay to, it's necessary for people to go into the unknown. And so it was quite early in the 80s when we said this, when people did say we have to be tolerant, we have to encourage, but we said the necessity of making mistakes. And I think that is very much in the culture of the organization.
What are some challenges the IT industry faces from a global perspective, both from a learning point of view and from a technology point of view?
Well, I guess in many parts of the world the talent shortage continues to be a problem. And I think also because the body of knowledge is changing very rapidly. So talent which was useful till yesterday, if they haven't adapted, they're not relevant. So talent shortage continues to be, I think, the number one challenge for the IT sector. The second is that we now have, with the whole .com phenomena, we have come into a world where the marginal cost of building the next little piece of information is close to zero. So let me explain this with an example. Someone makes a very nice piece of music. You can copy it digitally for close to zero cost. The first unit costs you a fortune. Okay? The second one, well, if you divided the whole cost by 2, it's still a hell of a lot. And the third and fourth and fifth. But as you go increasing the numbers and you come to the nth, which is a large number, the incremental cost is close to zero. So in the digital world, this phenomenon is a digital phenomena. So if I had, let's say, this one mug here, I want to make a second mug, right? It takes, if it's exactly the same, it takes double the quantity of raw material, which is in pounds and grams and kilograms. But if I have a piece of software, or I have something which is digital, to make another one, may cost me the same number of bits, but bits are not limited in nature. atoms are. So our whole economics of demand and supply determining price is predicated on the fact that if I have 10 pounds of something and there are people who want 20 of it, the price will go up. Because for me to make 10 more will cost as much almost as made. Whereas if it's digital, I can make the next one for zero cost. And the economics as we know it is built for the earlier model. So a very big challenge for this sector is that as we make IP and we're trying to protect it and the world says don't protect it, let it free, we still haven't quite found the method by which we create intellectual property and we protect it well enough, or how do we price it? To me, I think this is going to be a bigger and bigger issue as more and more of our life revolves around intellectual products. How to price them, how to make a profit. And that's why we had this dot-com boom and then we had a dot-com bust and we have companies which go from 0 to billion and billion to zero very quickly. This excitement will remain, I think, for some time.
Tell us why you decided to become an entrepreneur.
I don't think entrepreneurs decide to become entrepreneurs. It's only in hindsight you said there was a point in time when you did something. I think for most people, it's a continuum. It's more recent when we made these books on entrepreneurship and we have courses on entrepreneurship that people decide. Okay? We were doing something. We thought of doing something new. It hadn't been done before. It looked interesting. There was a need. So we just jumped out of our jobs. And people ask us, didn't you worry about it? We said, if we had worried, we wouldn't have started. Particularly in the last, let's say, till 2 or 3 decades ago, it wasn't as much of a kind of a well-defined thing as it is now. Now people can say when they're in school, and I want to be an entrepreneur, so I'll do this, then I'll do that, then I'll do a course, then I'll get this, and so on and so forth. So I guess if I have to see that, when I look at people who've jumped out and done something, it's comes again from an urge to find a space to do something which hasn't been done before, or to do something in a way which hasn't been done before. So there's that desire to take that step, and there's reasonable comfort. So when we say you're taking a risk, you don't realize you're doing something wrong. It's just that you have capacity to not be bogged down by what happens if it went wrong. And that's my definition of appetite for risk, that you find something interesting and you're curious enough to probe further and see, my God, this has not been done before. And if it's done in this way, it can help A, B, C, D, E. And then the fact that it will create economic value, to me, was less interesting than the fact that there was something nice to do, something important to do, something relevant to do. And so when we look back and say that we created talent which fired up a whole industry, so in retrospect, it sounds bigger than what it sounded when we were getting in.
What would you say has made you a successful entrepreneur?
First and foremost is good luck. I think we have to accept that because many other people have done similar things, but the set of circumstances which were thrown up at that time were helpful. I guess that's every one of us should acknowledge that the set of factors that happen around the time you're trying to do big things have to be favorable. So putting that aside, I guess if you have a curiosity to look for things and you're looking around the bend all the time, around the corner, ahead of others, and so you're spending a lot of time looking at things a little ahead of what's visible, then you have a real advantage. But then you need to be also rooted on the ground. You just can't have your head in the clouds. And there I think teamwork comes in very handy. So if you're lucky to, and you're careful and you're lucky to get a good team which has complementary skills. So you're looking at 360 degrees and you're also being philosophical but being pragmatic at the same time. So all these things very rarely come in one person. So if you can get around you a set of people who complement you, that actually is a very important aspect of gaining the success. And then you have to have a strong belief system, whatever your belief system is. And you have to get people around you who share in those beliefs, who share the dream that you have. I once had to comment at the World Economic Forum on, the title was Innovations in Organization Building. I think that was the word. So I said the 4 words that describe for me what we have done or what should be done to build a great organization. And the first of them is inspiration, which means that the leader has to inspire people with an idea which is bigger than what they have. If you have a smaller idea, no one's going to be inspired. And the second word linked to that is aspiration, which is that how do people respond to that inspiration? Do they feel, oh wow, can I do this? Then aspiration level's gone up. So this interplay of inspiration and aspiration is the stuff of the heart, as I call it. So a leader's job is to fire up the imagination, and then only then they get followers. Otherwise, who wants to follow someone who doesn't inspire? So these two words define what I call as the interplay of the heart. So let's say you put a big crazy idea in front of people and they get excited. Then comes the question that how do you do it? And the word that I use for that part is respiration, breathing, not of the lungs, but of the head. That do you create space? Do you create freedom of thought? Do you let people go crazy with their ideas? And do you let the idea gain importance, not the level from where it came, which is a big problem in hierarchical organizations. So respiration means that I have a crazy idea, and if I say it, will I be beaten down? Will I be laughed at? Or if the idea is good, will I be respected? So building a culture which encourages great ideas to be nurtured irrespective of where they come from. So I use the word respiration, that do I breathe, intellectually can I breathe in this place or not? And you have to build a culture for that. And so now you got ideas. You figured out if I told a set of guys who've never jumped more than 6 feet that we are going to jump 10 feet. They say, boy, if this guy can make me jump 10 feet, I'm going to go behind. That's inspiration, aspiration. Then you sit down and say how. And then you start figuring out how you'll do it and you get some ideas. But the fourth word is the most important, and that is perspiration. How do you get the thing to work? If you got an idea, how do you put it to work? And that is where this whole quality movement and zero defect and process capability, the how of doing the thing in detail. And this is roughly the sequence. So these 4 words talk about different things that you have to do for different areas. Each of these takes a lot of doing. But if you do all 4 of these, then you end up, I think, building an organization that can do well.
Mm-hmm. What advice do you give people who are looking to start their own businesses?
See, everybody comes with their own mindset, but when people do come, if they're thinking of doing something, the first thing you have to tell them is that work on the assumption that what you're trying to do has meaning for someone else, not just for yourself. And find out what is that meaning. What are you trying to do for someone else? Because the value that you create is not for your own self. The value, the basis of the value is if someone else finds your idea valuable. So the first thing is to do that, because many people get obsessed with an idea without realizing what value does it create for someone else. So that's the first thing, that what I'm trying to do, what does it mean to whom, and how clear am I that such a need exists? That's the first and foremost. And if you can think of that need ahead of anybody else, you have the elbow space to make your mistakes and so on and so forth before people catch up. That's the first advice. The second is that the detail is all that really counts in the end. Ultimately, the devil is in the detail, and so is the angel. Both are in the detail. So you got this idea, you think you can create value, but then you can't just, deal with it at a superficial level. You have to have the ability to go into the detail, and detail is key. And many good ideas fail because the detail wasn't looked at. Now that may not be in the same person. You've got to build a team. You have to have people who are really good in the detail. And if you as a leader, you are not as much the detail person, but your ability to roll up your sleeves and get into the detail, particularly in the formative stages when you're showing the way all the time. That's the second and very important thing. And third is, I think, when you're building the initial team, if your heart is not in the right place, you'll never succeed. You have to be liberal, you have to be generous, you have to be genuine, you have to be authentic, all those good things we hear. That's very important to build the right culture at a startup point. Otherwise, many people have seen great ideas, great detail, but somewhere the emotional integrity was missing and the idea collapsed. It just falls apart or something happens. So,
What lessons have you learned from any mistakes that you've made as an entrepreneur?
every day there's a mistake. So you're doing it all the time, but leaving that aside, if I have to look back, I feel that there were times when we were at the height of our success where we missed certain things. We missed certain segments which were getting created in the market. I wouldn't say we missed technology trends, but we surely missed some segments in the market, because there was one segment of market. Let's say we were working in the school system in India to teach IT. We worked in the government school systems. At one point we had 26,000 schools where we were teaching IT. But there's a whole private school system which is in size much smaller, got neglected. But we found a competitor of ours, catching up. So we had to cover up. So I think a mistake which can happen when you have very big success in certain places is it gets you so busy with the main thing, which is great now, that the next thing which is coming, or the thing on the side, you can miss out. So the blinker phenomena, I think that is something which we have seen at a few points in our history, and we've missed some things. So we're trying to learn and say, okay, if some people have blinkers around them, how do we build a group which is always looking the other side to see we don't miss things. So,
Do you think entrepreneurship can be taught, or do you think people are born entrepreneurs?
no, I think it's an overstatement that it's you're born. But yes, the capacity to take risk is part of personality, right? But I think I have found that there are many examples of teams of 2 or 3 or 4. You take a Hewlett and Packard, for example. Individually, I guess, if you looked at their personality type, it may not be like, a Michael Dell, for example. So there's a lot which has not been written about teams of individuals. The team can become actually a much more risk-embracing entity than the sum total of the capability of each. We've encouraged entrepreneurial teams as an idea, because each person would be risk-averse or would not like to embrace too much risk. But together they feel comfortable, one looking to that side, one looking the other side, and they can deal with the day and the night. So I think entrepreneurship to me is not something you can't configure. But yes, the sense of daring or the character of being bold, some of those are done by the time you're 5 years old. You can't change them too much. But you can figure things out and build a team which can be a very highly entrepreneurial team.
What about leadership? Do you think leadership can be taught?
Some aspects of it can be. And again, I think some of those which can't be are how courageous you are, how bold you are. You can't get a classroom of people who are very diffident in nature and make them into very courageous people in a classroom. But we do hear of enhancing the capacity to some extent, to push through all kind of emotional training and immersing people into situations and doing stress building capability. So, but I would say that between entrepreneurship and leadership, in both of those, leadership then tends to be much more of an individual thing. Entrepreneurship, I think you can build teams. You can have teams of leaders, but I think leadership at the end of the day tends to be much more of a lonely task. But great leaders, if they have great followers, are never alone in that sense, and they carry the burden of everybody. But to some extent you can, but perhaps to a larger extent there are some very innate qualities which, as I said, by the age of 5, are set by accident more than by design.
How would you describe your own leadership style?
I am very people-centered as a leader. Obviously think a lot about ideas. I conceptualize a lot of ideas, but I'm fortunate to have a team which can blow holes in it faster than I can create ideas. So we do a lot of bulletproofing of concepts, check out things. So I read and write a lot. Combination of generating a lot of ideas and also being very sensitive to people. I think this combination is what I find myself doing most of the time.
You and your co-founder have been leading the company from the beginning, and recently you decided to hire leadership from the outside. Tell us why you decided to do this.
Well, we have, as I mentioned to you, we have a software company, which the CEO is one of the people who's been there for a very long time, almost from the beginning. And in the learning company, Vijay Thadani and myself, we are the co-founders. He's been the CEO for a long time. And so very much as part of our succession planning, we have been looking at grooming the next generation of leaders. So in the software company, we brought in a person as the chief operating officer to work along with the CEO as part of succession planning. There's a good, I think, 12 or 13 years difference between them. So the next person will be the CEO in the next few years. And in the education company, Vijay Thadani and I, co-founders, we have been grooming a set of leaders. And we just brought in a person. Interestingly, he worked for the first 20 years of his life after business school at an IIT, and then went to work for a European software company for 10 years and has come back now after 30 years. So represents to us an outstanding combination of an insider who was there when we, pretty much in the early phases of the company, joined us in 1984 when we were 3 years old as a company and was with us. So in many ways, the whole organization building phase, he was very much part of it. So he's imbibed the culture as a youngster, first 20 years of his life. So he doesn't look to us like an outsider. So that's also very much part of the succession planning process. And he's CEO designate. He takes over as CEO 1st of April, which is our fiscal beginning. And but we remain active on the board because I think the company has so much to do. There's so many opportunities in front. So till now, we've been running the company and managing the board. And this will enable us to become far more active on the board and leave the day-to-day to younger people.
Tell us about a time your company faced a crisis and how your leadership style had to change during this time.
Well, I think for the first 20 years of our life, 81 to 2001, we really didn't encounter a problem. There was growth year after year. And the dot-com bust, when it happened, it actually sent a lot of shock waves through the whole sector all over the world. And our learning business was no exception. The software company made a transition into a different strategic transition. They handled the change in one way. The learning business, being a consumer business, almost stopped in the tracks because young people who were coming to learn computers and IT with us suddenly started wondering whether this industry is going to be around or will it have growth or not. So there was a huge jolt in the market. The size of the market for, I think, 5 consecutive quarters, the industry was shrinking. For the first 2 of those quarters, we also shrank as a company, first time in our history. But the 3rd quarter was flat, the next 2 quarters we went up. So at the end of 5 quarters, we were slightly smaller than what we were. But the market share had gone up because the rest of the industry collapsed much more. They kept shrinking for another 6 or 7 quarters. So we had a mixed feeling at the end that our market share is bigger, but we're a little smaller. But what we did when this happened, I think, is the important thing, that the moment we got affected by this shock, it happened for us the first time in our company. It took us a little while to even recognize it. So we promptly decided to invest intensely into new products, new projects, and into research. Which thereafter, when we coach our young leaders, we tell them that, when it's a human behavior that if you're suddenly confronted with a crisis, it is said that humans behave in only one of 2 ways, predominant ways. One is what's called the flight response, that you run away from it. The other is a fight response. So I guess we discovered at that time we had a very, very strong fight response. So deciding in the most difficult period to make the biggest investments we've done in our history. So this time when 2008 happened, the US, in India, it took a couple of years to come. We did the same thing again. And again we found that we were the first ones to start investing very heavily. So this time was a more considered thought. That was a kind of a spontaneous reaction. So I guess that was a crisis where when we look back at it, we feel very good we did what we did. And it was a gut reaction at that time. But the good lesson was that that's the time to invest when everybody's hiding under the sheets to stay away from the sand. So those are times when everybody else is on the defensive, and if you can be there before anybody else, when the dust settles, you'll be standing there. So that has been, I think, that was a good gut reaction, which has now become part of the company's story.
Mm-hmm. What qualities do you look for when you're hiring talent?
I think we value the human values more than we value skills. So we look for values in people because we think that the skills can be built. And we are involved in this business, so we know that you can build the skills. We obviously look for a certain minimum level of academic excellence, but we look for aptitude as well, because we found that in programming, for example, you may have got B grades in school, but you could be a genius programmer. So we have to be mindful when we are looking for young people. But even before we look at their intellect, we will look at their sensitivity, for example. So a lot of time gets spent. We look at their basic values, what do they value, what's good and bad. And we have very interesting ways to do that. But essentially, I think we spend a lot more leadership time in our interviewing than most companies do. That is simply because it's very difficult to judge all dimensions of a person. And it's easy to do measurements on measurables, but the most crucial things are not measurable. So now even in the university system, we have a very different selection criteria than most of the leading universities in India, which is much more around panel discussions of a range of people who look for different things in young people. So looking at the softer aspects of even creativity is very difficult to measure. Social sensitivity is very difficult to measure. So those are still done, we would say, by interviewing by a range of people. And integrity is a tough one, but again, something we try and look at. Then comes the question of the skill sets. And for that, there are many indicators which are usually available if someone's been there in a job before or someone studied somewhere. And then you can subject people to all kind of technical testing, which is easy to do, and they're reliable tests. So the skill part is there. And then, of course, we invest very heavily in people when they come and when they are with us. We are a benchmark company in terms of number of days of training per employee per year that we do. Benchmark, it's 2 or 3 times the average. So, and that has to be done. If as I said, the field is changing, so we have to keep doing it. So I think the interviewing process is very rigorous, and we deal with senior level people looking at young people first to see whether okay, not okay kind of issues, and then subject them to the technical testing, not the other way around.
Any qualities or anything that raises a red flag where you say, okay, this person we're definitely not going to hire?
That's difficult to say, but I guess you can look at people who may be too arrogant, too full of themselves, who won't be good team players. I think that we definitely look at. And teamwork is perhaps, what sustains organizations. Mm-hmm. Because people back up for each other and then they fill up the gaps. So then you don't need a few exceptional people. You need a lot of people who have complementarity and who can collaborate. And I think as we get into the so-called post-industrial society, collaboration between people is a very important quality in a company. So you don't want, cocky, self-centered, arrogant people. There are some roles in research, for example, if you're looking for some exceptionally bright people who will work largely alone, then there are other qualities you look for. There you may look for an arrogance, not of brusque type, but intellectual arrogance. That's still acceptable. But behavioral arrogance is not something we value. Yes, so human dignity, respect for people, to us that's very important, and that's you can kind of get a sense of it quite well. And we look for that.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever have a mentor? And if so, how did it impact your career and your personal life?
I've had many mentors. And so this word mentorship these days is becoming slightly different. These mentors are meant to be people with a halo around their head. But to me, a mentor is anyone I can learn something from. And I keep telling this story because this question was asked a long time back about regularity and being on time is, it's a given, but In many of our traditional societies, it was not the most valuable thing. And I remember that I studied in a boarding school in high school. And every morning at 6, the guy who would ring a bell and wake us up was an absolutely illiterate man, didn't have a watch. But he would ring the bell at 6 o'clock. So the question really was that if this guy can do it, why can't we? Why can't I? So I've always looked at attributes in people, or in things, or in animals, for example, that you can find very interesting attributes in so many different people. You have to look, you have to be curious. So I guess to me the teacher is not one person. The teacher is just an attribute of an individual that I admire. But yes, among friends, there are different people who are very good at different things, different kind of issues, different kind of challenges, and fortunately we have a big circle of people we know very well. So if there's an issue of a certain type, then I know who I should talk to. And fortunately have a lot of good friends. So, but I think many people look for the one label guy who'll do everything. I think that's not a good idea.